Hi, and welcome to the Data Plane API webinar for version 2.6. I'm Chad Lavoie, Director of Support for HAProxy. So if you've been with us for a while, you may have seen my webinar on HAProxy 2.5, or the Data Plane API 2.5 rather. I should clarify, given that the version numbers are synchronized, that the version number of the data plane API and the version number of HAProxy are not linked. So you can use the data plane API 2.6 with HAProxy 2.4 and vice versa. So it is just simply a coincidence that we have HAProxy 2.6 at about the same time that we have the data plane API 2.6. But the data plane API checks its configuration according to the local configuration, or according to the local HAProxy version. So you can use it with any version, even if it supports syntax that the underlying HAProxy may not. So with that out of the way, let's get started. A lot of this is going to be, the introduction anyway, is going to be very similar to the 2.5 API webinar, since it is covering pretty much the same material. Most of the changes from 2.5 to 2.6 are new keywords and a couple new sections, and we'll talk about that. And the majority of this, the interesting part of this webinar anyway, is going to be a demo, which I have the similar script to the 2.5, but I've added a lot more bells and whistles to what it actually does. So I can point out some of the things you can do with the API. So let's get into the introduction of what the data plane API actually is and why you might wish to use it. So the data plane API is a daemon. So it's a separate program that reads and writes HAProxy configuration files, or the HAProxy configuration file. And you can use it at the same time that you change the configuration by hand. If it's monitoring using iNotify the config file, so if you make a manual change, it will notice that change and update the version and update that in memory. So then when you make an API change, it will not overwrite your manual changes. If you wanted to disable that does have an option to disable the iNotify watching, but generally that is not desirable. It has an OpenAPI specification, so you can make a generated script which has all of its endpoints in it. The Python script that I'm using for this example is not built using the OpenAPI generation, since I only wanted a couple of endpoints. However, the generator is a good option if you're doing a lot of API calls with it. You can do pretty much anything using the API that you can do with the configuration. So you can add a front end, back end. You can modify the back end servers. You can add rules to block traffic. You can handle blue-green deployments. Pretty much anything that you wish to do. Some things are a little bit more complicated than others, but it's a great tool for a lot of use cases. So if you're just getting started with the data plane API, we have a link to the documentation here, which will be posted into the chat, so you can click on it for how to install it. That covers both the community edition and the enterprise edition of the data plane API. If you're using the community edition, it's pretty much the same as the enterprise edition, except you will have to build the binary yourself and run it yourself. And with the enterprise edition, you just run apt-get or yum to install it, and it starts the service file. If you're using the enterprise, and so once you've done that, you have the binary in place, or you've just installed the package. You can add a user list to the HAProxy configuration. You no longer have to. you can, so there's now two ways to do it. You can have the username and password that's authorized to talk to the data plane API and config, or you can put the username and password directly in the data plane API.htcl file. The data plane API will read either an HCL or a YAML file and read its configuration settings from that, which tells it things like where the HAProxy binary is, where the configuration file is, how to check its status, that kind of thing. And in addition to usernames and passwords, it also supports SSL certificate verification if you wish to configure that. And then regardless of how it's configured, you can visit the port, which by default is 5555, though the HCL file will tell it what port to bind to, /v2/docs, and you will get a HTML page which shows the various endpoints there. I'll show off that documentation page once we get past the into the demo part of this presentation. So once you've done that, you build the request by selecting what you want to do from the menu. You look at the query parameters that the documentation says are there, either the query parameters, which include the transaction ID and or the version number, and then the request body, which tells it what parts of the request are, and the method, and then you run it. And this can be done if you want something as simple as curl to make a modification, or something as complicated as doing a complete script. So here is a little bit more complicated of a Python script, which will get the configuration version. To make that a little bit easier to see what exactly it's doing, I will switch to my lab instance here. And say, for example, I have my configuration and there isn't currently any logging enabled in it, so I want to enable access logging. And because there are a lot of front ends and I don't want to worry about the configuration, I'm just going to run a Python script to do that. So if I run add logging, it will add my logging, and then I can make a request to log, and if I do run a show events memlog, it will show the request. So to look at what the script actually does and how it actually added logging, let's open up the script and take a look at it. I should note at this point that if you have any questions or anything you want me to focus on or that type of thing, feel free to type them into the questions box in the chat. I have it open on the side, and so if I see a question pop up, I will take a look and happy to answer anything. There will be a dedicated time for questions at the end, but if I'm talking about something and you're interested in something related to it, feel free to put in a question at any time and I'll read it as soon as it's relatively convenient for me to do so. Also, at the end of this webinar, you'll get a recording, so if you missed any part of it or the introduction was so boring that you fell asleep, you can reread the rest of it that way. So this is this code here, most of this code is identical to the 2.5 webinar code, so it just the function to get the configuration version, start a transaction, and commit a transaction. So if you haven't worked with the data plane API in the past, you have a couple of options when you're making a request. You can either specify the version number in the command line for every modification. So when you're, say, adding a new front end, for example, and you're making a post request to do that, you can either include the version equals parameter on there, where so for every request, you'd have to get the configuration version, or you can do everything in a transaction. A transaction is just a matter of doing a post request to a start transaction, and then when you're done making another request to commit a transaction. That's good because there's say, for example, in this case, I'm adding a whole bunch of logging if something goes wrong halfway in the middle because I made a typo in the script or something. It will not make half of my modifications to the config file and will simply revert the entire transaction until I figure out what the problem is, and it will also leave the configuration on the disk so I can take a look at what it did not like about the configuration. And of course, with transaction, you can also delete a transaction if you get through halfway through it and decide that you really don't want to do whatever it is that is being done. In this case, we have basic authentication, specifying the port and node to make the API request against. And starting off by getting the configuration for the memlog. So this is just looking for a ring buffer, which is one of the new features. So if you're not familiar with ring buffers in HAProxy, they were added, I think in 2.4, if I recall correctly. Might be 2.5, but they're used for logging. You can send either log messages from HAProxy to them, or you can configure a bind line so that you can have syslog messages sent over either UDP or TCP to HAProxy, which will then forward them to backends. In addition to so if the log forward, if you're just sending it to you just want to have HAProxy accept syslog and messages and send them to a syslog server, you can do that with a log forward section. But if you're doing TCP, where HAProxy receives the connections and then is sending them over TCP to a server, you specify a ring buffer, which holds the messages in memory until it can connect to the backend. You can also use this as a impromptu logging destination. In this case, for this API, I could have simply set it to send the request to an address instead of you setting up a ring buffer. But since a ring buffer support is a new feature in the 2.6 API, I figured I would show off exactly how to do that. So to specify a ring buffer, you need to give it a name and the size, which is how many log entry or how many bytes of log entry it's going to hold, and the number of log entries, and then make the request to the API, which will then adds the ring buffer configuration. It won't do anything with that itself. However, we can then make it actually use the log target in this. So in this case, I'm using the log target endpoint, which allows you to set a log and basically put a log line into the HAProxy configuration where you give it the usual arguments, notably address here. This could just as easily be an IP address if I just wanted to just use the API to set up logging to an IP. But in this case, ring at memlog is sending it to the ring buffer named memlog. And so I'm making a post request here to the log targets endpoint with the parent type of default, so it puts it in the default section. You can also if you wanted to set the logs in the global section, that can also be done by having this global instead of defaults, or you could put them in the front end instead as well. But the defaults will cover all of the front ends after it, though it will not cover global log messages like what happens when HAProxy starts, which would go to the global logs only. And it will then follow up with the sort of more this has been possible with the data plane API for a while, but I figured I would show exactly how to do this. So in this case, if I want to make a change to the defaults section with the API, you make a request to the API and it just returns the default section, because if I want to change a particular default section, I want to change only a particular setting in the default section. The post request has you setting all of the various settings. So if there's already a default section in place, this is basically going to return the changed or all of the entries in the defaults section configuration currently, which is put into the data section of the response. So I parse that out, and then I change the HTTP log setting in the default section to true. So if it is already set, it will overwrite it to true. Otherwise, it will add it if it's not already set and set it to true. And then I make the request to actually make the changes. So this can be done for other purposes as well, like setting timeouts, or in this, the same basic pattern is also used if you want to change the global section. So because the global section similarly has a list of parameters for everything in the global section. So if you want to change the SSL defaults, for example, that would be done via the something like this, just with global instead of configuration defaults. And finally, once that's completed, we have done everything that is required with the defaults changed, because for logging, all you need to do is set a log line in the default section. Alternatively, I could have set the log line in the global section and then set the log global in the defaults section to tell it to log to the global section in the defaults, or in a front end instead. There are multiple ways to do the same thing, depending on exactly what the goal is. And finally, commit the transaction, which will then actually make the configuration changes. And if there is a problem in the configuration for some reason, the commit transaction is also checking the config validity before it actually commits it. So if there are typos or similar, it will not allow the configuration to be applied, and the commit transaction will instead fail and print an exception telling you what went wrong, and leaves the configuration in /tmp/HAProxy so that you can look at it and see what went wrong and what needs to be changed. So that is the basics of the script in question. If you're interested in the script here, send us an email and we're happy to send it. I think the last time that I was here, a couple people were interested in the Python script. I'm not a Python script master by any chance, so I wouldn't recommend relying on my code as a single source of truth. However, I have used this a few times and it has not failed, and so it is relatively straightforward. So if you want something that is, instead of using the Open API generator to make a configuration, it's a reasonable place to start. So I'll cover a couple of the new features that were added just specifically that I didn't cover here. We have HTTP after request support was added. If you're not familiar with the HTTP after request directive, it was added, I think, in HAProxy 2.5, and it allows you to modify the response, or modify there's after request allows you to modify the request after after HAProxy is finished with it. So it allows you to perform actions on the request, like adding headers, even if you have commands in HAProxy that's modifying the request. And then we have all remaining global keywords. Notably, if you want to set the default 9 ciphers, you can do that with the API now. Previously you could set the cipher, the API allowed you to set ciphers on individual bind lines. However, for things like ensuring that the ciphers are reasonably secure and ensuring that elliptic curve ciphers are prioritized over RSA ciphers, since elliptic curve ciphers are about 8 times less CPU intensive on the HAProxy server, it's a good thing just to set it in the global section. And additionally, a Lua load per thread support was added if you So there was already Lua load support if you want to load a Lua script into HAProxy. Lua load per thread is similar, except if you have multiple threads running in HAProxy, there will be a separate Lua interpreter for each of the threads, which can improve performance. And if you're using a version newer than 2.2, you don't specify MB thread, you already have multiple threads. If you have multiple cores, it will spin up one thread per core. Generally, Lua load is recommended unless you want to unless your Lua script is set up such that you can have multiple of them running at the same time. As with Lua scripts, you can have global variables and similar that are modified from one request to the other. So if you're loading it per thread, that will change. So it cannot be just done indiscriminately. There are a couple of other minor bits and bobs. I will show the I'll show the blog post here, which will cover what it is, but you should also join us at HAProxyConf. The tickets are available now, and you can see me there, and I can explain why you should definitely be using the data plane API in person, which is always a good reason to be there. So if you want more examples of exactly what is new and how to use it in the data plane API, as with previous versions, there is a really nice blog post here written by the data plane API team themselves, which covers how to set a ring buffer and what the requests look like. And it goes through all of the things you can now do with the new version. Most of these are the global sections, all the global settings that you can now add. If you have any questions or comments or anything else, put them into the questions section, and I will be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I think that is everything that I have to say. If you have any questions, you can certainly get in contact with us. If you're interested in learning more about HAProxy, we have a selection of ebooks covering Kubernetes, API gateways, and security. So it's always a good thing to have if you want a guide on how to get the most out of HAProxy. And if you want to reach us, if you're a customer, you can contact support, and we're obviously happy to help you with the data plane API. Otherwise, we do have community Slack, and we're on Twitter if you wish to contact us that way. Otherwise, I will wait a few moments to see if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, thank you all for attending. So we have a couple of questions here. Is there any way to differentiate the permissions for different data plane API users? No. So the currently all the users in the data plane API can currently do all of the tasks. If you're interested in permissions for individual functions, we do the Fusion control plane, which is our enterprise offering, which is coming out shortly, has role-based access control, allowing you to have individual permissions for different functions. So you can give people access to particular front ends, that type of thing, based on scope. What you could do potentially would be to put the data plane API requests through through HAProxy, and for example, you could allow GET requests, but forbid POST requests or similar to that. But generally, that would be, there isn't anything built into the data plane API for role-based access control. The Fusion control plane with its GUI or its API does have that ability though. Is there any way to foundationally use filters? Let's see, I don't think I understand that question. Foundationally use filters. You can certainly conditionally use filters based upon, it depends what you want to do with the filters. So if I go to the configuration here and I look at one of the after response filter, for example, and I want to say remove a header, there's remove headers, set headers, set status to overwrite or you can even use the set response. You can use there's also an HTTP return. Response return, if you want to return an entire response instead of going through HAProxy, and you can specify conditions on there. But I don't know what foundationally means. So, which parameter data plane should be used if we want custom HTTP check for custom status code 200? Let's see, I believe the data plane API can already, let me pull up the, let's see, if I move the parameters out so I can actually see the line here, which one is my, this is Fusion, data plane API, it could be. So I can pull up the docs here and I want to do an HTTP check. I believe there is a section for that. I think it's part of the back end. I forgot exactly where it is, but there is a, here we go. So if I want to add a new TCP check, this is the method to do that. And if I wanted to check that the response code was a 200, that would be done using the, let's see, the status, I believe it was the R status configuration option in HAProxy, which is one of these I'm overlooking in the data plane API. Okay, so you set the match to, see, you can check strings. I guess it's not match for that. But there is one for setting the status. I would have to double check exactly which one of these API is the response, but it does. One of these does allow you to specify you can specify a string check, and there is also, I'm sure I know you can do it with R status in the API or within the configuration, and I'm sure one of these is the status, and I'm just overlooking it repeatedly. See, still confused with data plane API method you should expect. So this is the call that you make if you want to set the HTTP check expect. So this is done via, if I close this so I can see my screen again here, you specify in the arguments where it goes. So you tell it what backend this change is going into, and then you specify the check, and it will then add a check line so you can check the string or that type of thing to check what the response is. If that doesn't answer your question, let me know. But if I can spot the our status one, oh yeah, here we are, status code. So if you wish to specify the response status code, you can do that this way. That would be one of the post requests there to set the what the status is. Normally, if you do not specify a status restriction on an HTTP check, HAProxy will accept the 2XX or 3XX response code from the backend as healthy, though that can be set to any parameter you want. So you can do things like accept 500 errors as healthy, or only accept 200 errors as healthy, or only accept 302s as healthy, or whatever works for the particular backend in question. With all of that said, I think we are also out of time. So thank you all for attending. And if you have any further questions, please contact us and we'll be happy to talk to you further about the API and HAProxy in general. Thank you. Bye.